Okay, so Kelly, it's really good to be connecting with you and to talk about your book and your work. Uh, the book, I just want to, hold it up here so people can at least see it. We'll talk about it quite a bit. And it's Flying Lead Change, and we'll talk about the title. And the subtitle is 56 Million Years of Wisdom for Leading and Living. So we're going to unpack that and your work, but I like to begin with having people share, if you will, a little about your origin story, where you grew up, a little bit about your parents and what your life was like, and then we'll get into how all that weaves together with your work.
Great, thanks, Jed. And it's just a pleasure to be here and an honor because, as you know, I've been following your work for decades. And just thank you for what you do on behalf of men and women in humanity. So thanks for that question. Origin story. There's so many different lenses we could look through, so I'll just go with what is coming to my heart right now. Um, my mother, so I had two archetypal kind of parents. My mother was more the philosopher. She grew up in the UK in World War II and just and was institutionalized through going to boarding school at six years old. So you can imagine, being only 6 years old and living in boarding school until you're 18. And she had very little contact with her parents. So I would say that the grit of that upbringing, that very Dickensian upbringing, evoked a way of looking at life very deeply. Um, my father was a scientist. He was a preeminent archaeologist, had worked with Leakey on Richard Leakey's teams, and he's in the National Academy of Sciences. So my father was um, the passionate atheist, which is an oxymoron, I realize, but so there it is. He was a passionate atheist, and my mother was the philosopher. So kind of between those two polarities, I was raised, and my father ran the laboratory of anthropology in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So that's where I was born. And in those days, it was parenting by benign neglect. We just headed outside and maybe we came back for dinner. We better come back for dinner or else we were in trouble. Um, and because of my father's work, most of my childhood was spent in nature, in the outdoors, in and around archaeological digs, amidst indigenous peoples and cultures, running around freely. I have memories of daring my little brother to jump down into kivas, old kind of collapsed kivas, still, a 20-foot drop. Daring him to jump. I was just sure he could make it and then retrieve an arrowhead from the bottom.
Mm,
And, really, my mother was my first spiritual teacher. She handed me a copy of Khalil Gibran's The Prophet when I was, I think, 13, and just was a ever-present tether to seeing the world slightly differently. And but also, next to that were just these world views that were outside of contemporary cultural uh, cultural overlays, which were seeped in indigenous wisdom, earth-based wisdom. Um, Not so much as a child did these people teach me because we didn't speak the same language, but it was a
mm.
transmission from these cultural overlays, these a transmission from the natural world that taught me another way of being that I was not taught in school and that was not showing up in, America in 1970, 1980. So this sort of created a tension in me because a creative tension. I didn't feel creative at the time, but
Mm,
where I witnessed and experienced the natural underpinning of peace and joy and belonging on one hand through these other doorways of indigenous life and the natural world, and then modern life that is everything but that. It's
mm,
stress, it's oppression, it's dogma, it's punishment, all these other things. And I would say it was that rub that created my professional career,
mm.
because I
Oh,
wanted, right? I wanted to know what's that rub about,
yeah,
which is true,
yeah.
which one's more valid. The answer became very clear. And then how then to liberate first was my own personal journey, how to liberate myself from the trance of oppressive culture,
Mm,
and then how to liberate others from it.
mm. Yeah, that's so interesting. We've all had influences from our parents. I know
Mm,
for me, my father was a creative artist. He was an actor in New York in the 1930s, but he also like part of a society that put pressures on people and men and actors and creative people, and he became increasingly depressed. And when I was young, took an overdose of sleeping pills. He didn't die, but our lives were
mm,
never the same. And my mother had her father was absent when she was growing up, and she was sure she would die any day, and I would be alone, and she was
mm.
always preparing me for death, which was a strange thing for a child. And so I grew up with this strange feeling of not belonging to the world of humans. And in one of my books, 12 Rules for Good Men, I quoted the Eugene O'Neill, the playwright, in Long Day's Journey into Night, which is his kind of autobiographical play. And one of the characters captured my feeling, I think. He said it was a great mistake my being born a man. I would have been much more successful as a seagull or a fish. As it is, I will always be a stranger who never feels at home, who does not long and is disconnected from longing, and must always be a little in love with death. And
Mm.
so the human world for me was very frightening and alien. And what I did was I went and climbed big trees to find solace. And I know in your book you talked about your own. I wrote this down. You said I used to be reluctant about simply being human. You said. As a child, the disconnection, frustration, fear, betrayal, and confusion, heartbreak, complexity, and challenges that invariably came along with being human overwhelmed me. And that felt very resonant with my experience. And
Yes.
could you talk about that feeling of disconnection and your quest to find your place as I've done for my life? Where do I fit in all of this with that kind of belief that some of us grow up with?
Yes, well, it's just so poignant, right, to hear our shared story and some threads that are so similar, for example, the missing father, right? And how primary that is to shaping our sense of belonging. It just strikes me as you
Yeah.
speak. And how culture does not set, we are wired biologically, and you and I will talk about this most certainly, to feel a sense of innate belonging. That's actually how we're wired, but culture comes in immediately, prenatal, postnatal, early childhood. and severs that understanding. So, it's no wonder that two children, and I would argue billions more, emerge on the earth feeling severed, somehow knowing that's not congruent with what life is, and therefore really feeling a deep sense of lack of belonging. Add to it just some of, you said trees, and I too loved to climb trees and throw my leg over a horse and wade in creeks, um, and there were many images that very much impacted me as a child. And one was growing up in northern New Mexico, you would often see logging trucks driving down the highway with these massive trees being harvested, and before the U.S. government knew how to really hide that fact, just seeing great swaths of forest
Hmm.
decimated. And I was small. I remember being like 6 years old and just seeing that decimation and that war with Mother Earth and it impacting me. I was a very serious child, and I just was outraged. I couldn't, what were we doing? And to have that daily dose of being, sort of front and center of that kind of denigration of the earth. Unlike, say, if I'd grown up in an urban neighborhood, I would not have seen that.
Mm.
Lumber came from the lumber yard
Right.
in boards.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's an image that comes to mind. Another is, my parents had subscriptions to Time and Life magazine, and there was that image, right, of the Napalm Girl, Kim Phuc, who was running down the cover of just and this child and the war. And so the
Mm.
Vietnam War very much impacted me, seeing that on the news, seeing these images of war and children.
Mm.
So I think what was cultivated was a sense of social justice,
Mm.
environmental justice, and so these things further informed that what am I doing on this? What am I doing with on this earth? And also a kind of shame of being a member of this species that seemed so violent
Yeah.
and scary.
Yeah.
I don't want to be part of that.
Mm. Yeah.
So I did. I wanted to be something else. I wanted to be a horse or an eagle or,
Right.
please,
Exactly.
take me out of this. Jane, get me out of this thing. Um,
Indeed. And there was a shift for you. I want to, dive into the book a little bit, and a very powerful life experience when you went to Ethiopia as part of your father's, I think, travels and his work, and you met as part of that. I don't know if I pronounced it, a Romo, a warrior. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that experience and what you learned as your little girl
mm,
time in Ethiopia.
yeah, this is a really pivotal moment in my life and a super powerful story that actually I have right here on my desk picture. Um,
Mm. Hold that up
um,
again, just real quick. Yeah.
so
Oh,
yeah,
that's good.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that's 7 years old, Ethiopia. So so back in the day, in the 70s, my brother and I, two little blonde-haired kids in the African bush, were a kidnapping target. And Ethiopia was starting to kind of roil with a lot of political unrest. So my father, he wanted to bring the family out to Ethiopia to be with him for a few months. And my father hired an Oromo warrior. The Oromo people are the indigenous people of Ethiopia. And so he hired Kabata, and Kabata's job was to protect us from kidnappers, but more importantly, to protect us from baboons. And I'll never forget the moment I first met him. He was, easily, my father was 6'4". He was easily 6'6", 6'8", and he was walking behind my father and just in my child mind, my father was always this sort of lion of a man, but here was this other
Mm.
god of a man, comes
Yeah.
behind him with, just this beautiful white blanket slung over his shoulder that made him look like an emperor. And he carried a little metal lunchbox, and then he had this spear in the other hand, and he's walking. And I still remember seeing his bare feet, kind of how they walked the earth. And next to my father suddenly appeared so awkward. And he
Mm,
wasn't, of course, but just like the comparison of
yeah.
a wild, undomesticated male
Yeah.
coming towards me to protect me, to care for me. I mean, I have emotion just, thinking about the containment that he was going to provide for me and did.
Mm,
And I had, as a girl, American girl, never experienced that kind of containment. Not from my father, not from the male teachers in my school, never, not grandfather. This was like, wow, it was safe and he cared for me.
mm,
So it had a very, very powerful impact. We didn't speak the same language, of course, but everything was sort of pantomime. And I
mm,
convinced him that his real job was to be my playmate. And so obligingly, he would play hide and seek, and we would play cowboys and Indians and chase goats. And, he would have tea parties with my teddy bear and me. And this was how we spent our days.
uh,
So we talk about in biology the adaptive cycle in terms of evolution, and that's the kind of it's the pattern of evolution that the natural world takes to grow and evolve. And in order to activate a bounce forward evolutionary, we have what's called a disruptor. So, drought can be a disruptor, war can be a disruptor in our personal lives, divorce can be a
yeah.
disruptor, or something positive can be a disruptor. Kabata was a disruptor, a major
Mm,
disruptor in my life, because he showed me what true manhood was, what true fatherhood was, and wildness, in the true sense, and vulnerability and connection.
mm,
And so many weeks passed, and the time came for us all to go. It was early in the morning, still dark. Kabata, every night would stand by our door with his spear, just standing, not sleeping, to guard my brother and I. And this morning he wasn't standing by the door. He was slumped over in a little metal chair. And I didn't really understand what was happening. I didn't understand I would never see Kabata again, that we were leaving, that this was the end of this
mm,
chapter. And so I ran up to him and jumped on his lap with all this joy because I was so happy to see him, not realizing this. And then I was taken aback to experience that he was crying. I'd never seen a man cry.
mm,
And he just like pulled me into his chest and held me and cried. And we were like that for, I don't know, it seemed like a very long time. Could have been 10 minutes, but
mm. What a gift for both of you, to have that experience as a 7-year-old, to have all those experiences with a male and a father figure to your father figure almost. And then
yes.
what that must have given him to have this precious little girl that and boy, brother that
hmm
was from a different culture, to be able to, and it obviously touched him deeply.
mm
So that's just a really beautiful story. And I want to continue with you had some other stories around travel. You and I have a shared connection in Australia, where I've been, and I've shared some of my travels over a number of months in Australia as an adult, and the outback and so on. And you went to Australia, and to talk about a little bit what period of
mm
life that was for you, and you had an encounter with an indigenous elder named Uncle Bob, as you called him, and tell us about where you were in that stage of your life and your connection, what you learned from Uncle Bob.
Well, I think it's important to set a little context in order to tee up the
Yeah,
significance of Uncle Bob. Having had that existential experience with Kabata as a child,
yeah,
without a village, without a spiritual teacher, like without any of the underpinnings that are so important to a human being, I was kind of left with that schism, that polarity to work out on my own.
right.
And that led me to be very vulnerable to different spiritual groups, to kind of cult thinking. It led me to give my power away to certain, holy people that not
Mm,
all of them, some of them are the real deal, but some of them are not. And
yeah.
to be, to lay myself victim to a lot of that because I was looking for reconciliation,
Mm,
and to have a series of toxic relationships with husbands, and that's a plural. So it was, a very,
yeah.
right, sorry.
Yeah, the feelings are strong and the remembrances are
Yes.
powerful. Exactly.
So by the time I moved to Australia, I had become very um, disenchanted with my spiritual life, any sense of meaning or purpose. And I felt very betrayed by what society had lifted up as the good people. And so I, I, but at the same time, I was publishing a magazine, I was publishing a book. A publisher in Australia had asked me to pull together an anthology of stories on belonging. And and it was many different stories of different authors all around the world on this topic of belonging. Um, I I wanted to have the Indigenous voice of Australians in the book. The um, the the Aboriginal Australians are kept very separate. It's a very segregated country, and it's very difficult to cultivate authentic relationships with folks who are Aboriginal. So I wasn't sure how that would happen. I ended up, very long story short, having a miscarriage in France while I was visiting France to see some family. And coming out of that ordeal, I was in a cafe and there was a poster of a gentleman named Uncle Bob Randall. And the word uncle is a term of respect for elder Aboriginal Australians. And I saw the poster and I saw his face and I thought that's it. This is the man who needs to be in my book. Had I not had the miscarriage, had I not been in France, right? I don't think this would have happened.
Mm,
And so when I went back to Australia, and I had been living there for over a decade by then, I somehow, through a series of events, ended up, on a yellow sticky, with this number scratched on it. Try this number, you might be able to reach Uncle Bob. He wasn't on email, that it was.
right.
Um, so I called the number. And he picks up the phone and I said, Uncle Bob, this is Kelly Wendorf. And before I could get anything else out, he says, I've been waiting for you to call me. And he said, I have been wanting to send my teachings out into the world. I've got stories to tell. You're the person to do it. I'll meet you in Sydney on Monday. And he hung up the phone. Like that's all he gave me.
Sydney's a big city.
Yeah, I was like, okay. Now I knew he was coming from Uluru, from his little village of Mutijulu. Some people know it as Ayers Rock. The name is Uluru. So I knew he'd be coming by plane, or at least I pretty much guessed. And he didn't pick up the phone again. It was so typical of Uncle Bob. Like this is how you
Yeah.
roll with Uncle Bob. And I got a ticket to Sydney and stayed at the airport just watching people disembark. And there he was. And we just, from that point forward, started to work together. I had the privilege of basically parking a microphone in front of him as he um, downloaded his teachings, his stories. This made him a little bit unpopular with some folks, understandably, who feel that a lot of these teachings don't belong to the world, or let alone white people or a white girl.
Yeah.
But as Uncle Bob put it, and I believe that this is true, but is not to be taken lightly or abused, that he said, a lot of my people are so damaged and traumatized right now that their heart can't hear. And the teachings will die if I don't spread them. And these are for those with the Aboriginal heart. So,
Mm,
and so, we get to decide if we have the Aboriginal heart or not and be honest about that, right?
yeah.
Just to use Uncle Bob's words.
Yeah.
Yeah, he restored it, he brought me back to a spirituality that was not in a hierarchy of a guru,
Hmm.
but in a lateral hierarchy of our interconnectedness with
Right.
all things and nature. And so he restored my faith, just to put it that way, which really
Mm,
requires no faith at all because it's right here, right now, immediately available to us. No faith required.
exactly. That's a great story. And in the book, which I, we'll get into more as we go, that it's people when you hear you and you read the stories, whatever indigenous roots we have, and we all have them somewhere deep
Mhm.
inside.
Yes.
This ignites it. And I had again a serendipitous experience in Australia. I had been doing men's work for years and had been invited to speak all over the world and be part of conferences and so on. And I got invited to speak in Australia at a men's conference in Australia. And sometimes my wife would want to go with me, depending on where we were going. And she said, "Hey, Australia, I'm in, let's go." And instead of being there for the 5-day conference, since it's a long way, we decided to make a longer trip and decided to stay in Australia if we could for 2 months, if we could pull it off, and then go on to New Zealand and spend another 2 months in New Zealand, which we did. Well, it turned out again, serendipitously, the conference that I was due to speak at, um, they had been an indigenous men's health conference that had been going on. And as you said, separately, they were, the indigenous world was very separate at that time from the Anglo world, but their funding had been cut off for the Indigenous conference, and they worked out to be at the same conference where I was.
Mhm.
And so I just had opportunity to meet Indigenous elders who were part of the men's health movement in Australia. And then as we just met connecting, I, my wife and I got invited as we were traveling through Australia to come and stay in a number of parts of Australia with various Indigenous elders that we had met who felt a connection
Mhm.
and came back with some of the Aboriginal art that's part of the Dreamtime stories, which you know. So it was a very, very powerful experience. And in your book, you go into the journeys you've had in more detail.
Mhm.
And for me, your book was so powerful on so many levels. It's a beautiful memoir about a very unusual and interesting life and parents and all the intertwine. But it's also a real gift of guidance for how to live a life, as your subtitle says, leading and living. And I just again quote from your book, you said the book is a field guide to being human. It weaves together the influences of nature-based intelligence, indigenous knowledge, contemplative wisdom, and neuroscience for a new reality. Whoa. And I've that's a lot. And I think, as I've gotten to know you, when I read that in the book, I went, oh, come on, one person cannot have all of that. But in fact, you do.
Oh, thank
And,
you.
uh, and so talk a little bit about, if you can, the book for somebody that maybe hearing about it for the first time has not gotten into
Mm,
depth with it, but that is either intrigued by the title or whatever drew you to it.
mm.
What give me just a sense of the capturing of what those things were uh, that stand out to you as, in a sense, a newcomer to the book. What would you say?
Thank you. Well, so, going back to that origin story where there was the scientist and the philosopher as the archetypes for, and this is threaded throughout the book, right? These science and wisdom. Um, for me, I always felt obliged to pair deep wisdom insights with science if I could find it.
Mm,
To me, that's a very exciting intersection. So I am a researcher by nature, and find ways to weave those together. I think the largest invitation of this book, even though I reveal some teachings that were given to me with permission from various indigenous teachers, and there are stories and teaching stories in the book. This is not about culturally appropriating um, these wisdom cosmologies so that we can prop up or make ourselves feel better about the emptiness of contemporary life. Um, and this is why I call it a field guide, because what Uncle Bob showed me is that our direct contact, each of us, to the natural world that is available right at this very second to the house plant on your table. It is not limited by circumstances or socioeconomic, position or education or anything. It's available right here and now. And so the
mm,
book endeavors to strip away concepts and beliefs and narratives that keep us from experiencing that and connect the reader into their own sovereignty, their own connection to, so that they don't have to go and culturally appropriate smudging or whatever to feel like they can actually be in direct contact with and communication with the natural world that gives them a blueprint for how to live.
mm.
We I think that's probably the simplest way, that there is
Yeah.
a blueprint, and nature, and I am not anthropomorphizing it by saying this, nature misses us.
Mm,
We are nature. We took ourselves away through trauma. There's a whole bunch of research around the historic trauma of people 6,000 years ago who, started to feel like Mother Nature was a dangerous beast.
hmm
um, and so nature misses us because absent us and absent our collaboration with her, um, all of our efforts, from the highest C-suite executive to a Fortune 50 company to a mother, a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home father, those efforts are misaligned because they come from a core belief that we are separate.
Oh, wow. There's so much in what you're saying. And um, again, I want to talk about the title of the book because it's the first thing you see. It's big type. It says Flying Lead Change. Um, the subtitle I kind of understood, at least
Mhm.
in the words, 56 million years of wisdom. And I know there's a connection to horses that is part of that 56 million years of wisdom. But could you unpack the both parts of that title?
Sure.
What is a flying lead change and how does that tie in with the horses and the 56 million years?
Yeah, and I'm sure people listening are, wait, horses? When did we start talking about horses?
Exactly.
The title was deliberately mysterious, that main title, just to draw people in. So, um, so a flying lead change is an equestrian term, and I'm a lifelong equestrian. I used to be a professional horse trainer. And it is a term that describes a gymnastic move that a four-legged animal, namely a horse, makes when they're moving at a fast pace. So let's say you've got a horse galloping across a field or cantering across a field, and you can watch your dogs when they're running in the park. When they never run in a straight line, they always go in arcs, and in that arc they have to balance themselves a little bit like a motorcycle tipping to the side. If the animal is moving to the left and tipping a little to the left, they have to lead with their left legs to catch them as they move forward at a rapid rate. So that would be called um, being on your left lead. If the topography changes and they have to change their balance, they have to move to their right lead or vice versa. In order to do that, they have to bounce off the ground, all 4 feet in the air, and change sides.
Hmm.
So it's an amazing gymnastic move, but I love it as a metaphor because here we are at this turning point in human history, at this choice point. I think we can all agree that regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, regardless of whether you're American or not American, I think we can all agree we are at a choice point. We are looking at annihilation, and I'm not over, being
Yeah.
over dramatic in saying that. Our topography is changing. And we can't just change direction.
Hmm.
We have to do some physics defying leap and change the balance of power, the right brain, left brain. We have to change the balance so that we can go to an entirely different, direction. And it also kind of is relevant, the metaphor is relevant to biology in terms of evolutionary intelligence. Species bounce forward. A fish doesn't lose its gills, just kind of like that's a bounce to lose your gill,
Right. Right.
right? So we need a bounce forward
Hmm.
in a change of direction. And this is why I chose that title. Now, the horses come in because um, I, as a listener of nature, as a student of nature, one of my greatest teachers are the horse. And the horse is one of the oldest, most successful mammals on the planet. The oldest is the platypus at 150 million. Next in line comes the horse at 56 million. So they've been around through tectonic shifts and climate spikes and volcanic mega explosions and comets and um, and they're thriving. They're surviving and thriving. What is it? Compare that to our 6 million or, 200,000, depending on where you put the needle. But we are the babies in this
Right.
equation, right? In this 3.8 billion year story, we are the babies. What is it about a 56 million year old system that that we've missed, that if we took it on, we would lead better, we would parent better, we would relate to our partners better, uh, we would take care of our earth better. We would run better companies. We would, what is that? Because there's something about that 56 million years that has granted them this ability to thrive.
Mm,
And so there's a newly emerging field called biomimicry, which is this fancy word which simply means looking to nature and nature systems to solve human challenges. So what is it about the horse herd system? And what I've discovered is that they have a culture, just like gorillas, wolves, elephants have a culture. We don't see that a lot because horses are largely seen as a commodity. But they have a culture and it's very specific and it relies on five core premises: safety, connection, peace, freedom, joy. And the horse or horses that can keep those five premises intact are the leaders, and they don't do it through dominance and force and aggression like we've been seeing in movies that we see in Hollywood, but through care and presence. Now, when I take this model to my friends who are my indigenous teachers and First Nations teachers, they say, this is how we lead.
mm,
For 6,000 years, at least the Pueblo people here, and I have a lot of different friends and elders in those communities, this is how they have managed not to be eradicated, how they managed not to let the Spanish move them off their farms. And if you talk to some of these men, they will tell you leadership is care and presence. It's not domination, force, charisma, like we've been, and all this stuff we're taught in Harvard Business School. Um, so
yeah,
hence,
that's so
yeah.
powerful. And when we think, I mean, humans think of, if we think about horses, we think about humans and horses, riding horses, or,
Mm,
what we see in the movies about horses. But when
mhm,
what you're saying, and I think it's worth just surfacing this, if horses have been one of the most successful mammals, and we're mammals, humans are mammals, but they've
mhm,
been here 56 million years. Humans, depending on what point you decide humans, but at the outside, maybe 2 million years. So there were,
right.
before our, ancestors were around, horses were successful for a long time. And what you're describing is the wisdom that they knew that one indigenous people started to tune into if they survived, were
Mhm,
seeing their animal allies or elders that taught them what, how to live on the land. Well,
mhm,
they look to the land, they look to the animals, they look to the spirits of the wind and all of that, that we've, as you say very clearly and eloquently, we have become disconnected from those. And the opportunity in your book and your writing and your work and your wisdom school, which we're going to get into in a minute, is how those of us that are ready to hear and are open to listening and are open to our own indigenous knowing can get some more, in a sense, granular wisdom beyond what we've experienced. I want to just draw, and I was very pleased to see you quoted in chapter 9 of your book I found on place, where you describe the work of a neuropsychologist, Dr. Mario Martinez, whose work I know. Whoa, wow, you really do know something about the neuropsychology. And what he said very presciently, I think, was very interesting. He said that um, he talks about three universal archetypal wounds
mm,
inflicted on our cultural settings:
mm, mm.
shame, betrayal, and abandonment.
Yes.
And he goes on to say that there are three archetypal antidotes. So for shame, honor; for betrayal, loyalty; for abandonment, commitment. And I wonder if you could say a little more about how you found him and how that, very succinct wisdom ties in with what you've learned with
Mm.
your work with yourself and your school and your horses.
Yeah, thank you for that. Dr. Martinez is just such a gift to the world, and of course I stumbled into his work just because this is kind of how I roll, is really putting a lot of research feelers out there. One of the things the horses have taught me as an executive coach, as a spiritual mentor for people, is that um, people have to experience with their bodies, with their all of their neurocircuitry, learning. They can't just learn, intellectually, cognitively something and expect that there'll be real behavior change, habit change. They have to learn with their whole body. So, a lot of my coaching work, even when I do it virtually, um, relies on the understanding of the practice of somatics, the felt sense of something. And so when people are working with wounds, triggers, traumas, habit patterns, belief patterns, there is a somatic signature to that, and there is a somatic signature to the unraveling or dismantling of that. And that's the work that I do. We had this amazing situation happen many years ago where um, this framework that Dr. Martinez talks about was put into practice.
Yeah.
That's a great story. So it was many years ago, and I was some of my work is with corporate clients, and some of my work is with some of the underserved communities. And I was working with a healthcare organization that worked with the Four Corners indigenous peoples, Navajo, Hopi, Pueblo people. I think we had I can't remember, around 30 people and a whole herd of horses. And the work was supposed to be about cultivating leadership practices inside these organizations. But the strangest thing happened when the people entered the arena with the horses, something I didn't expect or anticipate, and also didn't really quite know what to do with. The herd, who normally is very respectful of humans, they really know the work that they're doing. They know how to give people space, not, be too scary with them or bump into them, acted like there was no one in the arena. They were walking past people as if that person wasn't there. They were walking through people. It was kind of a
Mm.
calamity. But I've learned over all these years to really trust my horses. So I kind of stopped everything and engaged in a lot of dialogue of, well, what's happening here? Why are the horses behaving like this? Why are they walking through all of you? What is going on? And it took a while, but at some point, what was surfaced was, and they named it themselves, was there was a collective sense that they didn't have the right to be here. And I don't mean here as in the arena, but here existentially. I
Right.
have no right to be here.
Mm.
Well, you think of the stories these people carry, and of course that's in their body. I have no right to be here. We have no right to be here. So I summoned, my recollection of my learning about Dr. Martinez's work, and we did an exercise on embodying the felt sense of honor. Now, some folks never felt that before, but it even works because, as you know, Jed, the nervous system doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's imagined.
Right.
For those that had never felt the felt sense of honor, I just said, well, what do you imagine it would feel
Mm.
like took about 10 minutes of just embodiment, where they felt it in their body, where does honor live, what's the texture of the honor, felt sense of honor. And it was as if someone flipped the lights on. The horses even, they kind of woke up from this trance of
Hmm.
like, and a couple of them were like, whoa, wait, what are you doing here? You weren't here 20 seconds ago.
Right.
If they were even startled, which shows that the horses could feel, how we show up energetically. And that imprint and that signature is so much more powerful than the actual physicality.
Mm,
That, yeah, the people were there, like you could see them in the arena, but
right.
they weren't there.
Right. Energetically, they were absent and
Energetically,
not
they were
deserving
absent.
to be on Earth, as I think is not only the people, the indigenous people that were at your school, but
Mm,
I think in some way humanity as a whole is in many ways, suicidal, feeling that we don't really deserve to be here. Maybe we ought to just take
yes,
ourselves out. And so we're living in a world of just, eat, drink, and be merry because we're on our way out,
that's
or
right.
we got to dominate. And so what I want to do, we could keep talking on each topic for a long, long time, but I want you to talk in a little more detail about your school and the wisdom school and what actually goes on there, because we talked about your experience, some of the indigenous wisdom, horses, and what you've learned from them and what you're continuing to learn since you started the school. So maybe just start at the beginning of the school. When did the school begin? And
Thank you.
what, what goes on there, and where are things now with the school?
Well, I started the school, and the school is called Equus, which is a Latin word for horse, Equus. And we have a campus called Buffalo Spirit Ranch. Um, and it was a long time kind of forming and becoming, but the seed of its becoming was because I realized that until we did change each of our fundamental understanding of our connection to all of life, that all we would be doing is rearranging the furniture on the Titanic, right?
Right.
That's it. So doesn't matter if you're the most senior leader, most successful CEO, and you think you've got it all happening, it's still rearranging furniture on the Titanic. So we need a different boat. So
Right.
this school is about a different craft, creating a different craft. And it's in person, it's also hybrid, and it's also online because there are so many people that we want to reach. The beautiful thing about coming here to the ranch is that you have all these energies supporting you when you come here. You have the energy of the land, and we are adjacent the Tesuque and Nambe Pueblos, and we have been given formal permission from the elders of the area to do this work. So even though this land is on the unceded land of the Tesuque people and the Nambe people, we are seen as a good relative. And so that matters, right? That energy underneath the land contributes to what is then transmitted to each person when they get off out of the car and come onto this property.
And just describe exactly where Santa Fe is, the big city,
Yeah,
big
the
town
big
where
smoke,
we're
as we'd say
talking.
in
For
Australia.
people that didn't remember when you talked about at the beginning, you
Yes.
you were born in Santa Fe, and
Yes.
so and kind of give people who either don't know Santa Fe or kind of where your school is.
Mm. So we are 15 minutes from the historic Plaza of Santa Fe. Santa Fe is in the northern region of New Mexico, and we're up high. We're at 7,500 feet. So we're in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and so and surrounded by 19 area pueblos. So just again the energy of the land, and even the land surrounding this land,
right.
is very much seeped in ancient wisdom.
Yes.
And as the horses have taught us, that energy is what makes the difference. Yeah. So,
That's so great. So people can
mhm,
come physically there. Say a
mhm,
little bit more about what you offer physically and
mm,
how people get there and how long they can stay, and then some of the other ways that people connect. You said you're
thank you.
reaching people in different modes, directly, online, and other ways.
Yes,
Kind of
thank you
fill
so
that in a
much.
little more.
If people choose to come here in person, so we do private retreats, private custom retreats, one-on-one with me. I custom design the experience. Some people
Mm,
come for 2 days, some for 4 or longer,
mm,
and it's a very in-depth, personalized experience. And in that in-person work, they're working with me, the horses, the land. I might pull in my ranch manager whose name is Thunder Bear Yates. He is a wisdom keeper for his people. The time goes very quickly because people just immerse themselves into a completely different paradigm. Sometimes people will come for just a couple of hours to be with me and the horses. We do YPO groups and EO groups and women's retreats. My partner Andrew does men's retreats here. So, groups, individuals, couples, families, those kinds of ways in. And I would say the primary thing that people come here for is to be with me and the horses so
mm.
that I can help facilitate that conversation that the horses want to have with them about how they too can thrive in whatever way they define that.
That's so
So,
great. And one
mm,
of the things that just touched me deeply is that I think people are longing for guidance in our world. They're longing to be part of something that is positive, something that has roots that go back before a lot of the craziness that humans have visited on the earth and have been visited on them.
mm,
And to have some elders in the form of people like you that have learned all of this, and the horses themselves, that their wisdom is 56 million years, and interacting with them, you get something, at least from, I haven't been there, so I'm hoping maybe someday I can,
you
but
must. Yeah.
um, to be able to see you, feel you, and to validate both when you're not in yourself, as you described, and when you are, home in yourself, to be
Yes.
able to have that experience. It's like
Yes.
I'm imagining getting validation from an unimpeachable source, because they don't lie. They're not going to tell you you're there if you're not there, and
That's
if you
right.
are there, they're going to interact with you in a way that lets you know you're there, you're home,
That's
you're
right.
feeling. Yes.
That's right. I mean, unimpeachable. That's such a great word. Thank you for that. It is. It's unimpeachable. There's no way that you can manipulate a horse out of that feedback.
Right.
Who is it? Daniel Siegel, who said, to be seen, to be heard, to feel felt, and to get gotten. This is what people experience
Right.
sometimes for the first time in their life
Exactly.
with the horses. And this isn't equine assisted therapy because it's not a therapeutic lens. It's a holistic lens of human possibility.
Mm, that is
Mm,
so great. And
mm.
you mentioned your partner Andrew and the things he does with men's work. I'd like to have you talk a little bit more about the male-female dynamic, because you know hu- humans have a lot of confusion
Yeah.
and conflict these days about that dynamic. Um, Mammals as a whole and horses as an example don't have that same kind of confusion, I think. And there's some very clear energies around male and female. Could you talk a little bit about
Yes.
just the male-female dynamic, both in terms of your own relationship with Andrew, that you
Mm.
know, have the work that you do together around, the work, and a little bit about what he may be doing, I know, around men in particular, and then I want to share some of my experience that ties into that.
Thank you. Yeah, I look forward to hearing that. And I want to tread very carefully because some of what I might say could be a little triggering. Um, and I, it, it also applies, even though I'm heterosexual, what I'm about to say also applies to homosexual relationships and queer relationships because it has to do with masculine and feminine energies.
Right,
Um, what I have found in being with intact indigenous communities, not traumatized ones, but ones where they're still very much tethered to their cosmologies and their language being a big driver of this. And the horses is that the masculine is designed to contain the feminine. And I don't mean contain like control or oppress, but more hold and protect so that the feminine and her power can shine and thrive. I had an experience with, there's a ceremonial dance that the Tusuki people do. It's a corn dance, and the women are all lined up in their regalia with their feathers and all the beads and the shells and everything. And then behind them, each woman is a warrior, a man. And so again, these are energies. So if you identify as, a different gender or you're in a homosexual relationship, it's about like getting clarity about which energies are embodied by whom and when and where. But in traditional kind of man woman and in this dance, you could see the you could see the difference, and the genders are different. And you could see the sovereignty and empowerment of both, and that the masculine was behind the feminine, containing her in a way that brought safety and respect, deep, profound respect, and kind of handling things so she doesn't have to, so she can handle the bigger things that are spiritual and powerful. And I took a women's group to watch this, and all of us were just moved to tears because we hadn't felt that you could feel the containment.
yeah,
We as women had not felt that containment by our brothers, by our fathers, by our partners or our husbands. And it was hard to articulate because we didn't even have the language for that,
right,
right? It wasn't even there. And you look at, if a man doesn't have a father to contain him, then he's not going to learn how to do that. And with Thunder Bears community, little boys are contained by their fathers, and then they're initiated and contained so that they learn to then contain their community and and there's just this beautiful way of honoring the feminine, Mother Earth, women, that does not diminish women, but actually lifts them up.
that is so powerful in imagery. And I said I wanted to share an experience that I've had that you and I haven't talked about. I just want to share that my wife and I, Carlin, have been together now for 46 years.
Mm.
And we've been married before, and we talk about that in my website. But in this context, a number of years ago, I've been doing men's work for a lot of years. She's been doing women's work, and there was an opportunity for us to go to a workshop that was being put on by one of the men in the men's movement world named Michael Mead, who's a storyteller and mythologist. And unusually, because she hadn't done this before, with a woman uh, named Clarissa Pinkola Estes. who's a storyteller herself and an author of a book called Women Who Run with the Wolves. And the name of the gathering, it was a workshop, a 1 day workshop in San Francisco, the Palace of Fine Arts, which is a very relatively small, theater, two or 300 people. And the name of it was called Ovarios y Cojones, ovaries and balls, translated. And they each took turns sharing, and it was just a wonderful, gathering. And at a certain point, Clarissa said she wanted to offer a poem. And none of us who even knew her work knew that she wrote poems. And it was somewhat of a surprise. And so, okay, and, go ahead. So she offers the poem she calls Father Earth. And
Mm.
just when I heard that name, the hair on the back of my head stood up. I mean, we don't hear that term. I hadn't. And so here was the poem that she offered.
Mm.
She says, Father Earth, there is a 2 million-year-old man no one knows. They cut into his rivers. They peeled wide pieces of hide from his legs. They left scorch marks on his buttocks. He did not cry out. He did not cry out. He held firm. And now he raises his stabbed hands and whispers that we can heal him yet. We begin the rolls of gauze, the gut, the sutures, the grafts. Slowly, carefully, they turn him over, and underneath him, the old woman is perfect and unmarked. He has laid upon his 2 million-year-old lover all this time, protecting her with his old back, with his old scarred back. And the soil beneath her is fertile and black with her tears.
Mm.
Father Earth, Larissa Pinkola Estes.
Yeah.
And in the room, you talk about the feeling of all of a sudden a whole different way of seeing, feeling, touching. And I've shared this with many gatherings, and men, particularly in the men's gatherings, get tears in their eyes, feeling so, finally there's a woman that gets something about us that
Mhm.
we've known, but we don't
Mhm.
hear very much in the
Mhm.
world, and certainly not from a lot of women. And so I think this sensibility, and as you were talking about what you were saying, I think this captures in many ways both what needs to happen, what is happening if we can feel it and see it and touch it, and what you have been doing in your school and what you and Andrew and others are doing. And I just
Mhm.
wanted to just see what reactions you have to that poem. You haven't heard this until I
I
shared it
have
just
not
now.
heard that poem, and I love good poetry. And first of all, I love how I didn't know where it was going to go. Like, what's going to happen to this man?
Yeah,
And I love how he's been protecting her, and just the um, and again, but without the diminishment of her. And sadly, there are so many concepts and ideas about what protection and containment mean that it can frighten people to think about that. And women have um, learned how to kind of do it alone. Absent that containment, and I think generally speaking, the sense I get it that a lot of men are very confused, like, well, what's going on? I don't know what to do or how to be anymore. And absent any kind of cultural practices or father practices, then there's just so much lostness.
indeed.
And I wrote an article recently about I write a lot of essays, and and I wrote one recently about the new wave of feminism. And what I see is that there's an evolution happening where the Me Too movement was an important disruptor to say, like, hey, we need to be heard here, and we're not being heard. And it kind of started out with women calling men out and calling predators out. But and where I see it evolving to now is women calling men into a possibility of right relationship. And we don't really know exactly what it is either, because we also have suffered at the hands of this culture.
Yeah.
I remember sitting on my portal here with a Pueblo elder, an old granny, they call themselves the Sayas, um, and a younger woman was talking about the Me Too thing. It had just sort of erupted, and she was like, "And yeah, we need to call them out." And I was like, "Yeah." And she looked out into the distance, the old granny, she looked out into the distance and she just shook her head like this. And we were like, "What?" Yes, we need to call them in.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
this is where
exactly.
we are, right? This is
Yeah,
this new
exactly.
possibility. Um,
Yeah. And I
yeah.
feel that what you and Andrew and all the horses and the people that you have connected to and with are calling us to a new opportunity, a new way to
Mm,
be that I think so many of us know in our hearts it's time. And
mm.
this is our time. It's clear. I've said she and I've, been friends for many, many years now,
Oh,
since both before and since she shared that. I keep
mm,
telling her, you need to write that. She's never written that down. So and
mm,
maybe it's not meant to be written down. It's meant to be part of an oral tradition that gets handed down. If you memorize the poem and share it, then it will be part of you in a way that reading it but in any event, it's not written down anywhere as far as I know from her. Um, but talk as we wrap up for today, and I hope we will have more opportunities to share and talk. And I'll be developing an article where I'll talk more about your work and so on. But um, share a little bit about how people can reach you. What's the
mm.
best place? And I'll put this in,
Thank
but just to
you.
verbalize it, and
Yeah.
anything you might want to say as we wrap
Yeah.
up today before we move to the next phase and stages of our lives together and apart.
Oh. Well, first of all, most importantly, I really want to thank you for this conversation.
Yeah,
I'm aware of the space that you hold so that certain words want to come forward. And that's not possible without you holding that space. And so I'm just very grateful that you facilitated the ability for us to take things so deeply and so meaningfully. And I'm very touched. So thank you. Um, yeah, very touched, very moved. I think the easiest way for people to be in touch with me is through my website. If you subscribe, I write a lot of essays and things so that people can access me freely. And that's equisinspired.com. And Equus is EQUUS inspired.com. And Equus is Latin for horse. Or my book, Flying Lead Change, which is on Amazon. Those are the two easiest places. I read my email every day. I'm a slow responder because I'm outside with my horses a lot, but I do read everything that comes to me. So I'm happy to be of service.
that's great. Well, we will definitely continue to be in touch and to do our work together. And it has just been a delight to talk to you today, and I look forward to continuing that. So bless you for the work that
Thank
you
you.
do, and so glad to connect with you now and to see where this continues as we move on and give what we can do at this very interesting, challenging, and very inspiring time of life.
Yes, yes, indeed. Thank you, Jed. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.